Why is behaviour in school getting worse, and what are we going to do about it? I'm going to explain the neuroscience into exactly what is going on in our schools and in our classroom and what our next steps are. We make behaviour easy using neuroscience, and we use the behaviour brain methods, which is the brain science behind behaviour. Because when we understand the brain, behaviour becomes easier. I'm Danielle Douglas, the Behaviour Brain Consultant from the UK's first behaviour and neuroscience school. We now proudly support over 80,000 educational influencers, schools, teachers, residential children's homes, and children across 87 countries. Our tools and techniques are award-winning, and they underpin our frameworks, models, and our whole-school behaviour curriculum. So I didn't wake up one day and think, you know what, the world needs another behaviour specialist. This role was born out of pure desperation and lack of availability. In 2007, I walked into a classroom for the first time and realised very quickly that I was asking 30 children to do what I wanted them to do and not what they wanted to do. I learned the hard way. In 2011, I had my first class with significant special educational needs in the mainstream classroom. There was over 70% SENS. And it was after a tough Ofsted inspection that I was sitting in my car thinking, I need tools and techniques and methods that actually work, not opinions, and something that is going to work with every brain. Alongside teaching, I opened my first business, which was a summer camp for children. This grew to 2 separate sites and over 1,000 children attending a week. I had 30 staff looking at me for behaviour management strategies that I needed to provide, which had actual evidence that they were going to work. So I needed something even more crisis than this, crisis behaviours of the most vulnerable children. So I started working in a residential children's home. Alongside working in the residential children's home, I became a foster carer. I decided to study the neuroscience into helping those crisis children and those crisis behaviour brains. And that leads us to where we are today. So the first thing that I want you to do is grab a pen and some paper. Our brains forget over 50% of information within 1 hour, which means in an hour's time, you are only going to remember 50% of information of what I have told you today. So I need you to grab a pen and paper so that you can make some notes so that you don't forget. So what is going on in our classrooms at the moment? We are in a behaviour crisis. We are in a retention crisis. We are in a recruitment crisis. We are throwing all of these behaviour management tools and techniques that have been around for centuries at these children, and they just don't work anymore. They are not backed and supported by neuroscience. We've got a lack of consistency, a lack of direction. We all know in the schools that I work in the schools that we see every single day, every teacher's doing something different. Year 4 are using Dojo. Year 1 are using the clouds. We have no consistency in terms of behaviour within our schools. Teachers are spending around 2 hours a day managing behaviour. That is 10 hours a week just trying to firefight and manage behaviours within our schools. Imagine all of the things that we could do in 10 hours a week. So the first thing that we're going to do is have a little reflection on our own schools and our own classrooms. How long do you spend managing behaviour every day? What is your biggest challenge when you are facing behaviours within your school or your classroom? And if you could change one thing tomorrow, what would that be? The problem is behaviour, but I also want you to consider who teaches the behaviour within your schools. Do you have a behaviour curriculum, and is it progressive? If we want to see a behaviour in a child, are we teaching that behaviour, and how often is that behaviour practiced? So there are 7 things, there are more than 7, but there are 7 things that we're going to talk about in this webinar of exactly what is happening in our schools and why behaviour isn't improving. Problem 1, teaching behaviour. Neuroscience tells us that behaviour is a skill. It needs to be taught, learned and practiced. Just like driving a car, tying your shoelaces, doing the new pose at yoga, it is a skill, which means it needs to be taught and practiced. It takes around 66 days to develop a new habit, which means that within our classrooms, we should be teaching, modeling, practicing behaviors for at least 66 days. On top of that, we know that brains lose over 50% of information within an hour, and they also process images faster than words. Yet how are we teaching behaviors in schools? We teach hours of maths, hours of literacy, yet do you have an allotted time within your school day that you teach behaviors? For the last at least 7 years in the school that I have currently been working in, we have changed the first week of education, and our school behaviour curriculum starts in the first week of school, which means that we teach and practice all the behaviours that we need within that first week. What do you do? I was having a conversation with a teacher recently, which is why I've put this in. But she said to me, her words, that I have done a whole morning on behaviour and they just don't get it. So I just wanted to show a little visual of exactly what is happening to our children's brains over 72 hours. So it's not that the children don't want to behave, it's that they physically cannot remember. Problem 2, behaviour is communication. This phrase and language used in schools is causing a problem because behaviour is a tiny, tiny part made up of communication. There is so much more to behaviour than just trying to communicate. And when we understand the behaviour brains, we learn that this is actually less and less true the more that we hear it. Behaviour is actually made up of years of expectations, reinforcement, hormone response to behaviour, the language used around behaviour, and the experience and response that a child has had. So I just want you to be more aware of the situation is that behaviour isn't just communication. There is so much more that makes up behaviour than just the brain trying to communicate. That leads me on to problem 3, the amygdala. Neuroscience tells us that the amygdala drives all emotional behaviors. The amygdala is in charge of our emotional response, our fight or flight. However, when the child or our brain is in the amygdala, it means that we cannot listen, learn, process, or understand. We want children to be in the prefrontal cortex and use the amygdala as little as possible within schools. However, our schools and our systems and our structures put children into the amygdala thousands of times a day without even realizing. Change to structure, change to routine, change to the table setting, unexpected events that happen all put children in the amygdala, which means they cannot listen, learn, process, or understand. When a child is upset, they have left the learning zone. Yet our children are being put into the amygdala thousands of times a day. We don't know how to get them out, so they're being left in the amygdala. And on top of that, we're then expecting them to learn in the part of the brain that is physically impossible to learn in. So how much do you know about your behaviour brain? We teach the behaviour brain and the parts of the behaviour brain that we use to listen, learn, process, and understand, and the bit of the brain that hijacks that process. This is a quick whistle-stop tour of the behaviour brain because that is a different training. But this is your amygdala. And in your amygdala, we know you cannot listen, learn, process, or understand. His job is to protect you, and he is in charge of your emotions. However, he hijacks our brain throughout the day over things that you would never even think about. He can hijack the brain when he's fallen out with friends. He can hijack the brain if he's been moved seats, any change to structure or routine, any new environment, any new person. Then he can hijack the brain, which means we cannot listen, learn, process, or understand. This is the Douglas hierarchy of brain, and we have created this to show the parts of the brain that children are in linked to Maslow's hierarchy of needs. So we can see here that if the child is at the bottom of the hierarchy of needs, they are hungry, they are tired, they don't feel safe because they've been moved seats, they don't feel loved, they've fallen out with friends, they haven't got belonging because they don't feel part of the class. Even being hot or cold can make children's brain go into the amygdala, which means they cannot listen, learn, process, or understand. So it's so important for us to learn if our children are in the amygdala and how to quickly pull them out of that. We have got a course and some information on how to switch children's brains from the amygdala into the prefrontal cortex as quickly as possible. Problem number 4, visuals. Now, this has come from a conversation that I had really recently with a teacher from a secondary school. And he said to me, we don't need visuals in our school. It's a secondary school. Well, neuroscience shows that the brain processes information that is visual and pictures 60,000 times faster than words. 90% of the information that our brain processes every single day is visual pictures. Yet in our schools and in our classrooms, we've got no visuals anywhere. Problem number 5, consequences. We know neuroscience tells us that for a consequence to change behavior, the brain needs to be in the prefrontal cortex. We also know for a consequence to work that it needs to get children to either think, problem solve, or question. For a consequence to work, it needs to be timely and it also needs to be linked to the behaviour. Yet within our schools, we are giving consequences such as time out or letting children just sit there and think about what they've done. And we also give children consequences in the amygdala. This is not going to work. For a consequence to work, we need to make sure that the children are in the prefrontal cortex, that they are thinking, processing, and that the consequence is linked to behaviour. This means that taking golden time away on a Friday is not going to change behaviour. Problem 6, and this one causes so much conversation and chatter, especially on the internet. One of our problems is our chairs and our environment. It takes children around 81 muscles to sit on a chair. This means that they have got 81 muscles engaged at all times to be able to hold themselves on a chair properly. If they cannot sit with their feet flat on the floor and their knees at a 90-degree angle with their back supported. After 30 minutes of children being sat in the position where they're using their 81 muscles, they go into something called muscle exhaustion. Now, what happens in muscle exhaustion is that it causes behaviours very, very similar, if not exactly the same, as ADHD behaviours. Muscle exhaustion causes lack of attention, distraction, anger, frustration, hunger, sore muscles, tired, extreme attitudes, and that is all because of a chair. So schools, we give chairs that are one size fits all. I have worked in one school for almost 8 years, and the chairs in reception to year 2 are exactly the same, and the chairs in year 3, 4, and 5 are exactly the same, and then the chairs in year 6 are a little bit different. We decided in year 4 on the first day of every term to see how many children could sit with their feet flat on the floor, tummy to the table, bum to the back. There was at least 17 children out of 30 who were unable to sit on chairs properly. So we made something called seating boards to support our children's feet. What happened with the behaviour, the concentration, their attention was phenomenal. And it was picked up by educational psychologists and CAMS teams coming in to assess children for ADHD. If you would like to know more information about this, please let me know. Problem number 7, routines and structures. Neuroscience tells us that our brains need routines and structures. What happens is we've got prediction machines in our brain. So our brains are prediction machines and they like to predict what is going to happen next. This helps us stay safe, which means that we can keep our prefrontal cortex engaged and turn off our amygdala. However, what happens in our schools is that we have got sometimes disruption to routine, lack of structure. And what happens is the brain goes into something called prediction failure. This means it jumps straight to the amygdala, which then means they cannot listen, learn, process, or understand. So what are we going to do? This is just 7 problems that our schools have that contradicts what we do in schools to the actual neuroscience and evidence-based practice behind the behaviours. So what can we do about it? The first thing that we've done to change our behaviours within our schools and to cause negative behaviour-free classrooms by October is to create a behaviour curriculum. We use our behaviour curriculum to progressively teach behaviour from reception to year 6. The next thing that we're going to do is use neuroscience. Use all of the neuroscience that we know influences and impacts and changes behavior. We can't punish behaviors that we don't teach. So if we don't teach the behaviors that we would like to see, then we can't punish them. If you would like to know more information about the neuroscience behind behaviors or how we can actually use neuroscience to teach and change behaviors, then you are in the right place. This is a brief outline of a progressive curriculum that you might use within your schools, that we use within ours. This is at the moment, right now, being used in schools within the UK and is changing behaviour on a daily basis. Now, this is the outline of our behaviour curriculum and how it leads children from co-regulated adult-led behaviours all the way through to peer-supported behaviours. This means that we've got schools and classrooms right now operating. The independent behaviours come before the end of Key Stage 1. We've got children who are independently behaving and teaching others how to behave in Year 4, and we've got peer-supported behaviour and regulation in Year 6. This means that our schools are negative behaviour free, and each teacher doesn't have to reteach behaviours from the year before. There is nothing more annoying than getting children into your classroom and having to reteach behaviours that they should already know. If you have found this training interesting and the information that we've spoke about interesting and you would like to know more, you are definitely in the right place and you need to check out our other training or our curriculum. I'm Danielle Douglas. Let's talk behaviour.